Now we're seeing some of the most distressing images coming out of Australia, your iconic wildlife being scorched and burnt. Can you tell me just how many animals is being affected by these bushfires?
Our latest estimates for New South Wales alone are over 800 million animals have been affected, and that's just mammals, birds and reptiles. If you look at the entire extent across all of Australia, making a number of assumptions about densities elsewhere, it's well over 1 billion.
I mean, the sheer scale is just unimaginable. So tell me, what kind of animals are being affected most?
It's the ones that are most immediately affected are the ones that can't get away from the flames, of course. These are species like the koala, other species of marsupials that depend critically on the trees, like the possums and the gliders. But there are also quite a lot of species that occur on the ground layers of the forest that can't get away and get burnt when the litter gets burnt as well. And then there is another group of animals that may well be able to move away by flying or going underground that are likely to suffer the consequences of these wildfires later on, from lack of food or lack of water, lack of habitat, and even being picked off by predators that move into the fire from surrounding areas.
And we cannot avoid that image of seeing, the kangaroos.
It's awful, yeah, and there are a lot of people out there who've been dedicating huge amounts of time to trying to manage the extent of the fires, but also rescuing kangaroos, koalas and other animals as they come across them, and bringing them in for veterinary care and to be looked after.
Now, your environment minister has said that, it doesn't need to be fluffy and cute. It's also the scaly and the scratchy animals that count. So some ecologists say that this will spark, a wave of extinction. What is your take on this?
I think there's no doubt that some of the already threatened species with small populations and small distributions will be subject to extinction as a direct consequence of the fires. These include some small marsupials and small bush birds, even some frog species. The southern corroboree frog is a good example in the Australian high country. There will be the likelihood of further extinctions down the track if we see a continuation of these events in the future, as populations of even common things at the moment begin to diminish in population size with repeated fires.
Well, that takes me to my next question. How much damage is done? How can we measure that? And is there any hope for repopulation?
In many areas there should be hope, because the bush itself will recover. There's no doubt that the eucalypts in many areas will resprout or regenerate from rootstock. Many of the other plants will come back as well. And when they do, they'll provide habitat and food resources again for the animals. If the burnt areas have been in continuous areas, then there might be the chance for animals to come in from outside, from undisturbed areas. But if the areas have been fragmented already by roads or development or agriculture or other activities, it'll be much more difficult for animals to move in across those kinds of landscapes to get into fragmented blocks. So the recovery there will be much, much slower.
Professor Dickman, I want to ask you, what can people do to help? Because obviously there's pleas all over the internet to obviously fund. So what is the most effective way of helping?
Probably for the moment, it's going to be for the animals that have been brought into care. If there are donations that could be sent to WIRES and other organisations that are caring for animals, veterinary centres that are looking after animals that have come out of the fires with injuries and burns. For the longer term, probably the best hope for biodiversity will be to get everybody together. We're looking at something that is really unprecedented. These fires are more severe, they're of greater extent than anything that we've seen before. And I think what it's going to require is an all-of-community approach. The scientists, the ecologists, environmental scientists, planners, the community coming together to see what the predictions are for the future and how we can best mitigate them, both as a community for each other and for the biodiversity that otherwise we're sadly at risk of losing.
Well, I want to ask you, you have spent, decades working as a conservationist. On a personal level, what is your message to the world? What are the warning signs that we need to read here?
Well, A lot of the early predictions had Australia as being one of the first countries to be affected by climate change and to be the country that was probably going to suffer the worst effects. That's because it's already a dry continent, and I think we're beginning to see those initial effects of climate change. And I think if Australia is anything to go by, if what's happening in Australia is likely to be happening elsewhere in the world a little further down the track, we need to pull out all the stops that we can to prevent that from happening.
Well, a very interesting conversation, and I hope some sort of relief comes to the bushfires soon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Elaine.